Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Coaching the Bible. This is episode 186, season 4, episode 26. I hope you are doing well. I hope you had a great week. Our topic of the week is silence, the power of silence. Let's get right to it. Our win of the week and our learning of the week. Our win of the week is something that actually didn't take place yet. It's going to take place tomorrow. Is the opportunity that I get to run a short race with 3 of my children, a 5K race in the city nearby, the city called Modi'in. I missed the race a few weeks ago in Jerusalem. I was traveling that week, and I ran last year in the 5K, and I've been trying to run 5Ks. It hasn't been going well. That's to be part of the learning in just a second. But the win is the opportunity to do that kind of a thing. Those are special moments. It doesn't seem like a big deal. Maybe others might not view it as such a big deal, but for me it is a big deal for me to get out there and run, one, but to be able to run with the kids, or at least to start with them. I don't know that I'm going to finish with them. We're certainly in different age brackets for the race itself, but it's an exciting thing to be able to do, and I'm looking forward to that very much. It's early tomorrow morning, so that'll be great. The learning is related to that, is having sort of wanted to prepare for it and be ready for it. I had attempted over the last few weeks to sort of get into a position to be prepared for the race in a way that I would be happy with myself going into it tomorrow, and I'm not there. Simply just didn't do a great job with the workouts, with the runs, with the practices, and I realized that the key learning here is that if I actually want to improve, then I really need an actual plan. My daughter and I talked about the idea of next year going up a level and not just going to 10 to 10K. I pushed the idea that we should go to a half marathon. And so to go from a 5K to a half marathon in 1 year is a lot of work, and it requires a legitimate plan, of which I have none at the moment. I've done a little bit of research, a little bit of reading, but it's something that as of next week I'm going to have to get more serious into. And obviously the discipline that's going to be necessary for that to actually work and succeed, and for the accomplishment to come at that point, will be a big deal. But that's the learning, is if you're going to make a statement, if you're going to put that out there, you're going to want to do something, then have the integrity to do it right, to prepare it right, to get it right, and then to execute the way you want to execute. Okay, our topic of the week is silence. And it comes to us very obviously from this week's portion. This is a very powerful portion in the Bible, a portion known as Shemini. This is the consecration, finally, of the tabernacle in the desert. There's a lot of pieces to this. We've discussed different aspects of this over the last 3 years, and this being year 4, here's a specific aspect of it. In the aftermath of this very high, holy, spiritual moment, where the presence of God comes down and rests on the tabernacle, effectively proving that all the work finally had paid off, and that it was successful, and that it had met every measure. They had done it properly and right. God's presence is there. The 2 eldest sons of Aaron are killed in a tragic event. The Bible is not exactly clear, we've talked about this before, as to what exactly they do wrong. They do something wrong or inappropriate. Exactly what it is, I think we've discussed in the past. That's not our focus today. Our focus today is Aaron's reaction. The Bible tells us Aaron's reaction immediately in 2 words. Aaron was silent. It's a stunning reaction. To go from the sea of high in spirituality and celebration, exaltation, holiness, sanctity, and then, boom, like that, to have his 2 sons killed in front of his eyes on that day, after all this time, silence. Just earlier today, I heard a talk from my friend, Rabbi Doron Perez, who I've talked about a couple of times over the last number of weeks, whose son was killed on October 7th. He talked about silence, that exact silence, the silence of a parent mourning a child. the silence of a person coming to comfort a person mourning in that way. But the appropriate response, in quotes, to coming to comfort someone in that space, he said, is silence, because there are no words that can provide comfort. The comfort is in the closeness. The comfort is not in the words. So silence is appropriate, and sometimes silence is power. Years ago when I taught high school, so if the class got rowdy and I was looking to discipline in some way, shape, or form, I would do two things. I would go exceedingly quiet and incredibly calm. Years later, my students told me that I was at my scariest when I was in that space. Because they said, when someone is ranting and raving, yelling and screaming, whatever it may be, that you had gotten to them, that you were under their skin, that you had won. When the person goes silent or soft spoken in those moments, which is what I would do, that actually scared them. There's a power in silence. The Ethics of the Fathers teaches us in the first chapter that Simon said, that's the way the verse opens, Simon said that he had spent many days amongst the wise, and he found nothing greater for the body than silence. Later on in the Ethics of the Fathers, I think it's in chapter 3, it tells us that a great fence for wisdom is silence. There's a famous quote attributed to Abraham Lincoln, which was actually not said by Abraham Lincoln, but actually appears in another work, which is, better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak out and remove all doubt. Because there's something powerful in silence. The verse in Proverbs chapter 17, even a fool, if he keeps silent, is deemed wise, intelligent if he seals his lips. There's something to silence. Aaron's silence is almost hard to believe. Some of the commentaries make the point that if the Bible tells us that he was silent, the implication perhaps is that at first he reacted or had wept or had intended to react, but that the response of Moses in between caused him to be silent. I remember years ago I spoke at a funeral. I was serving as a congregational rabbi. I spoke at a funeral. A funeral was for a young person. I think she was in her late 20s, early 30s. It was a relative of a congregant. I didn't know the person. They just didn't wake up in the morning. There are no words for that. The only words are to speak into the silence and evoke the silence of Aaron in that moment. And so it's interesting to bring it up and to think about it and to talk about it, because there's actually a power in silence for a leader. Blaise Pascal is quoted as saying, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Isn't that true? How many of us struggle simply to just sit quietly and have silence around us? Even when we're doing an activity in silence, typically speaking, we're doing something else. We're not just sitting silently and doing nothing. And so there's a lot to think about. There's a lot to consider when we think about silence. And I wanted to, for just a few minutes today with you here in Coaching the Bible, pick up on the idea of silence, although not in the space and not in the way that it's discussed in the Bible around Aaron and his mourning. And certainly, I would never say to somebody who, God forbid, something like tragedy happened, that they should be silent and not weep and not mourn and not be pained for their loss. Absolutely. And everybody around them too. That's appropriate. It's commandment, basically, that we have to mourn. We have to have emotion. We may not understand. We may not grasp the depth or appreciate the why of something like this happening. And we may never. But there's something in the silence. And on the flip side, there's also something in the person who can't handle the silence. Recently, I was visiting another person, another friend of mine whose son was tragically killed in Gaza as well. The parent, he sat there quietly. There was nothing to say. So raw, it was so powerful, it was so painful. There were so many people around, and he just sat quietly. And then someone started talking, but it was inane, and it was, I would say, wholly inappropriate as to what they were talking about. And then you realize that some people simply can't handle the silence. They can't handle the discomfort. The reality of it is that silence is a safe and should be a safe and sacred place for people. The people who are closest to each other should be able to sit in silence and it not be an issue whatsoever. A conversation for someone with a spouse, with a friend, can come to an end, and now there's a silence, and maybe it's even an extended silence, and that's okay. Those two people are close enough with each other, they do not need words. The irony of it actually is that the power of words is what distinguishes humanity from the other animals in the kingdom. They all have maybe some form of communication, but the ability to communicate the way we communicate, the level that we communicate, sometimes actually taking that away from us actually reaffirms our humanity and doesn't allow us to sort of slip into the space of being an animal or a beast. Because it is sometimes when a person has an inability to control their words, an inability to stop talking, an inability to close their mouth, they're just sort of vomiting language that doesn't show a lot, it doesn't say a lot, it doesn't spread a lot, it doesn't imply a lot of good about the person. And so it's super important that we can be able to embrace silence on occasion, and in fact, lead with silence. And so there's a lot of literature on this subject with respect to, obviously, like everything else we talk about the power of silence, but also the benefit of silence, and why it's necessary for a leader to sometimes lead with silence. So one obvious one is that your silence as the leader empowers others. So instead of jumping into a conversation, I've worked with a couple of leaders on this in coaching, is the ability for an issue to be discussed and talked about where you, the leader, don't speak first. The reality of it is that once you speak as the leader, it often shuts down the conversation. Conversation can't continue, or sometimes don't even show up. I know you mentioned it once before. There was an organization that I worked with, that I worked at a number of years ago, where I held my first team meeting without the CEO of the organization, and it was a free-flowing conversation, and it was really creative and interesting and good. Then the CEO walked into the room, and you could hear a pin drop. Silence entered with the person, not the silence we're looking for. But on the other side of that is if a leader introduces an issue or is thrust a question on a specific thing that's going on in the company, a product launch, an issue, troubleshooting, is to empower others by remaining silent, by holding back and allowing other people to speak, by not even saying out loud that they should speak, by intimating that with a silent gesture. Additionally, you can emphasize a point with silence, right? If you talk too much, if you say too much, you actually can hurt the argument you're trying to make. By being economical with your words and being careful with the word choices that you make and stopping at a certain point, you may be able to further emphasize and power up your point as opposed to sort of destroying and corrupting it by having too much to say around it. Sometimes it happens when you'll get pitched something on the phone and you actually want the object, you want the thing. You can tell the person, stop selling, because if you continue to sell, I'm not going to buy. So there's a point in the process where silence is golden. We have it in fundraising. After you make the ask of a donor, a potential donor, for a sizable donation, in that moment, there should be silence. You do not fill that with more words. You've made your ask, Mr., Miss, so-and-so, would you make a $50,000 donation to our cause. And then it's quiet. Because if you fill it with your air and your words, you destroy the heft of the moment and the opportunity for the person to think about what it is that they want to say. Because negotiating is another way in which it really fills the silence. And so there's a lot of benefit in the silence. The question then becomes as to how do you sort of train for silence? How do you put that into being for your team or for yourself? And so the first way that I want to share with you, I'm going to share with you three things today. The first thing is what we'll call silence is golden and embracing the pause. I think that's very powerful. Embrace the pause. What that means is that every time you're going to say something in a meeting or in a conversation, and this should be pre-planned, otherwise it looks weird. Before you start to speak, pause. Hold for a moment before responding to the question or the comment. You can do this in team meetings. If everyone knows it's coming, it'll be funny and weird the first time, but after that, it'll become very powerful because people will learn the value of silence and the value of what we'll call a pause protocol, the ability to hold for just a moment before they then jump in and offer an answer. Number two here is to really go with listening, right? So in the absence of language, in the absence of words, leave out the nonverbals and, hinting at something with your eyes. But the power of listening is incredibly powerful, important here. But become what we'll call the silent empath here. By being silent, you can actually hear what other people have to say. You can actually get to the answer that you're looking for faster and more quickly, by virtue of the fact that you're not sort of saturating the area with garbage noise. And so by stepping into the listening mode, you can appreciate and pick up on where the other person is. We've talked a lot about empathy. I think it's a very powerful way to enhance your silent power by becoming more empathic through your silence. Number three, here, I think, and this would be super interesting, I would love to see this actually tried, is actually cultivating silent spaces in your certain environments. So, living in New York for many years, when traveling on the Long Island Railroad, they had the quiet car. There were certain sections of the Long Island Railroad that you certainly couldn't speak on your phone in that car, but even conversation was frowned upon. It was the quiet car. Even recently I saw a video of a senator who was being harassed on a train, who told the person who was harassing him, I'm not going to respond to your questions because this is the quiet car. It was an easy out. But to have silent moments built into the schedule, a quiet zone in the office space where people can work undisturbed, where conversation is frowned upon, where it's a space where people can go silent, encouraging people's practice of silence and even meditation or mindfulness allows people to get centered and focused, and obviously can get a lot of work done. So it would be an interesting exercise to sort of throw in there. And the last one, and I'll throw in just as a bonus here, is leading without words. I think here you can do a lot where you can influence decisions, you can have conversation, you can communicate with other people without using words. And therefore you can convey messages in other manners, and it teaches you how to convey a message in another way, obviously, but it also helps you appreciate the minimum number of words necessary to actually get the message across. And so the way to practice this would be to do an exercise where the team is together and they're doing something together, but without verbal communication, no direct verbal communication. So you can write, body language, other nonverbal cues that allows other people to get the point without actually having to hear your voice make that. So I think there's something very beautiful in developing and cultivating for yourself and for others the power of silence, the power of your silence, to get comfortable in silent spaces that are around you. I think there's something very powerful in that as well. Because if you can't sit still in the silence, even a little bit, there's something there. There's something that's touching on the edges that needs to really be worked on. And so that's something that I think we hadn't talked about this before. I'm glad I've had the opportunity to bring it up now. And let's end with a quote from Edgar Allan Poe. The true genius shudders at incompleteness, imperfection, and usually prefers silence to saying the something which is not everything that should be said. That is Coaching the Bible for this week. Look forward to seeing you.